Let me introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Robert Chandler, Clinical Psychologist at the LightHouse Arabia. Really, really good to see you all, if not a little bit late. So listen, what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen with you in a second, and we can get going. Okay. So we are here today to talk about coping with COVID-19 anxiety. As I say, I'm going to get through this as quickly as I can. Hopefully today's talk will be relevant for thinking about coping with COVID-19 anxiety, but also anxiety more generally, because we know that whilst COVID may be the content of our anxiety, actually anxiety is something that we all have and will persist in different situations across life. Okay, so many of the ideas that we talk about today are also relevant for other forms of anxiety. Okay, so let's get going. This is the LightHouse Arabia at a glance. I won't spend too long on this. For those of you that aren't too familiar with us, one of the biggest clinics, or I think the biggest clinic in the UAE, home to the Rami Grief Centre, and we have community at the heart of absolutely everything we do. These are the range of services that we offer. This is our wonderful team. And let's think about the learning objectives for today. So I really want to introduce you to anxiety in the brain and to understand the neurological underpinnings of anxiety, because I think once we understand how anxiety works, then we can start to think about what we do with it, how we manage it. Okay, so we will come on to that in the second part of today. So let's have a look at understanding anxiety within the context of the brain. So this is your anxiety 101, okay? We all have anxiety. It is a normal human emotion. It's in our wiring. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have anxiety. So what is anxiety? Anxiety is a normal emotion that comes up usually when we think about the future, that idea of what if, okay? Anxiety is not good or bad. In fact, we need an optimal level of anxiety, and you can see this in the figure at the bottom, because optimal anxiety means that we may perform at our peak. Okay, so a little bit of anxiety is a good thing. You know, for instance, as Zoom wouldn't connect at 10 o'clock, I was sort of being a bit frantic, trying to figure out what was going on, making calls. If I didn't have anxiety, I probably wouldn't be here right now, because no anxiety would mean that I was just like, oh, it doesn't matter about getting onto the webinar. It's not a big deal. I won't be disappointing anyone. It's not a problem. So an optimal level of anxiety is good because it drives us, it propels us into action. But clinical anxiety is where we cannot stop worrying, okay? We cannot stop those intense anxiety feelings that may present with panic-like symptoms and in a sort of paralyzed type state. So I want you to hold in mind that a little bit of anxiety is a good thing. And as we go through today, we're going to learn ways to keep it at that optimal state. What we do know is that unmanaged anxiety can tax the mind and tax the body as well. If we have prolonged and unmanaged anxiety, that's going to build up across time. In terms of the difference between fear and anxiety, I want you to hold in mind that fear is your body's natural response. Okay, so if I see something scary over on the horizon, then my body will automatically respond in a fear, with the fear response. Okay, that is an automatic process for which I have no control. Okay, but what I do have control over is the anxiety part. So anxiety is fear plus my brain thinking. Okay, so I want you to hold that in mind. Fear is your body's natural response. Anxiety is when your mind starts becoming involved and thinking about it. And what you can do by thinking is you can prolong the fear response, even in the absence of that feared thing, whatever that may be. Okay. So let's have a think about how this actually works in the brain. And I want you to imagine that my fist here is your brain. Okay, this is your lovely big prefrontal cortex at the start, the front of your brain here. Okay, and in the middle here we've got this almond-like structure, the amygdala. Now, when you are calm and relaxed, you are doing lots of higher order thinking. So you're able to plan, to problem solve, to use reason, to use logic, all of these very higher order cognitive abilities. But when you are stressed, so when the fear response kicks in, you quite literally flip your lid, okay? And the amygdala will start sending adrenaline and cortisol flooding through your body, okay? And this is where the emotions of sort of, fear, anger, hate, disgust, all of these powerful emotions are sort of driven from the amygdala. Okay, so the goal for us is to try and get our prefrontal cortex back online so that we can think more clearly. Okay, this is the impact on your body when that fear response has been activated. So that amygdala at the center of the brain will send a message to the adrenal glands, which will produce adrenaline and cortisol, which floods through your system. You will notice an increase in your heart rate, your blood pressure will increase. You'll notice that the liver converts what we call glycogen into glucose, which gives you lots of energy. Blood is diverted to the major muscle groups, and this prepares you for fight or flight. Okay. And what we do know is that with anxiety in particular, or the fear response being activated for a long period of time, the long-term projects in your body will shut down. Okay, so your digestive system will shut down, your reproductive system will shut down, and the sort of body's rationale for that is that you do not need to be digesting your lunch if you are about to become somebody's lunch. Okay, so it's that idea that what we don't need in our bodies at that time gets spread to the areas where we do need it. Okay, so what are the symptoms of anxiety for us to look out for? Well, firstly, we've got the psychological symptoms. So we're thinking about things like catastrophic thinking. Okay, so we might be prepping ourselves for some kind of meeting in the morning or something like that, and we're catastrophizing. We're saying, you know, I just know it's going to be wrong. I know it's going to be a terrible day. I know it's not going to be very, very good. We might catastrophize in relation to the pandemic. I'm sure I'm not going to be able to travel until this time next year. So we may catastrophize. Our thinking becomes narrower. We may see defense mechanisms kicking in to try and manage the anxiety. Defense mechanisms are a sort of unconscious mind's way of trying to soften overwhelming emotions. Okay, so if I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety, I may use humor as a way to try and experience that anxiety less intensely. I may dissociate from the anxiety. So although I feel really anxious, I may just cut myself off from it. I may numb the anxiety. I might engage in sort of overeating or drinking alcohol or using substances as a way not to feel that emotion. Or I may intellectualize the anxiety. Okay. Now, sometimes thinking in a rational way about anxiety is not a bad thing, but if we are constantly intellectualizing what we are feeling, over the long term, this can be unhelpful. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this towards the end. The behavioral responses, we might notice we become restless. Thinking about the pandemic, we may excessively wash our hands. Obviously, washing our hands is a very good and sensible thing to do, but we might be doing it excessively. If I was using my soap dispenser here sort of every 5 minutes, that would be excessive. Okay, we might see panic buying. We might see sort of hoarding in the early phases of the pandemic. People generally seeming edgy or having anger outbursts potentially. In terms of the emotions, you will see when somebody's anxious, there may be irritability, despair, hopelessness, helplessness, feeling overwhelmed, panic, a general sense of uneasiness. And often when people are experiencing clinical anxiety, they will say, I just feel uneasy and restless all of the time, even when there isn't anything to be scared of or fearful of. I will just experience that a good deal of the time. In terms of our cognitive presentation, we know that having anxiety actually impairs our ability to form coherent memories. Okay, we will notice an inability in concentration. Our concentration may be reduced, our judgment reduces, and we may find that we constantly worry. So anxiety can have all of these effects, and for a group of professional service people, this can be problematic if we're noticing that it's difficult to concentrate because our mind is elsewhere. And the reason for this is because those higher order cognitive abilities that we need to perform well at work when we are relaxed are offline when we're really anxious. And for those of you who may have been going into a big meeting previously or having to do a big presentation or talk, may have found that actually your judgment wasn't quite as good in that meeting if you were highly anxious. All right, so these are some of the symptoms to watch out for. I want to introduce you now to this idea of stimulus and response. Okay, so stimulus is the feared stimulus. So this could be COVID-19, this could be a presentation at work, whatever the stimulus is, you will then react or respond in relation to that stimulus. Okay. Now, for many of us, when we're experiencing anxiety, it feels as though we don't have a choice. It feels as though our response is automatic. So if I'm reading the news and I see that, I'll give you a personal example, that the UAE is still on the UK's red list for travel, I may read that and I may start panicking, worrying, running around saying I'm not going to get to go home for another year. Okay, but I've actually got freedom to choose, all right, how I respond. Wonderful quote from an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book about his time in the concentration camp in Nazi Germany. And he talked about the idea that man can take everything from us except our ability to choose how we respond in any given situation. Okay, and that's quite a powerful quote. So it's the idea that no matter what happens in front of us, we still have the ability to choose how we respond. Now, in relation to anxiety, the anxiety-provoking stimulus may be there. Now, our fear response is going to get triggered, but actually we have a choice about how we respond in relation to that fear response, okay? I can start engaging in panic-like symptoms. I can start phoning everybody and telling them how awful the next year is going to be stranded here in the UAE. But actually, I've got a choice about whether I do that or not. And that's what I want to introduce you to as we go through the remainder of today. So when we are just simply reacting to what's going on, that's emotion-based, it's feelings-driven, it's inconsistent, okay? But when I am responding, okay, when I'm proactively responding and deciding how I'm going to respond, generally that is values-based, that's choice-driven, that's more consistent. Okay, so if I'm choosing my mindset, my headspace for dealing with this global pandemic is going to be measured, sensible, I may notice that I still get triggered by the news, but I'm thinking, okay, this is anxiety showing up. I have a choice about how I respond in this given situation, all right? So let's have a think more specifically about COVID-19 anxiety and what to do with it. Guys, the first concept I really want to introduce you to is the idea of radical acceptance and willingness, okay? Now, what you resist will persist. Many of us have very little control over aspects of what's going on in the world in relation to the pandemic at present. And we psychologists talk a lot about the concept of radical acceptance. And this is sort of rooted in Buddhist philosophy, if you like. And it's the idea that that we have to accept life on life's terms. Yeah, we have to essentially play the cards that we are dealt. There is so much that is outside of our control. And actually, to go as far as to say sometimes control is a bit of an illusion. And so the idea is we have to be accepting that we are in this pandemic. Now, there's a difference between me saying, well, of course, I accept that the pandemic's going on, but I have to be radically accepting of that, okay? And that's the idea. And that is more than just me saying to myself, I accept it. That is me saying, you know, I don't like this pandemic. I don't want it to be here, but I'm willing to make room for it. And as soon as we make room for it, we reduce the suffering. Okay, we reduce the suffering. Once we stop fighting against it, we reduce the suffering. So this isn't about just allowing life to sort of take us over and saying I have absolutely no control whatsoever, but it's about us saying I surrender to the things that I have no control over. A lot of energy goes into not wanting to feel something. I sometimes use the analogy of, I haven't got one here, but I don't know if anyone ever had a Chinese finger trap where you put a finger in both ends and you pull, but as you pull, the finger trap kind of comes down on you, it tightens its grip. So the way to get out of a finger trap is to lean into it, is to push in. And then what it does is it starts to release, okay? So if we're spending all of that energy fighting against the pandemic, not wanting it to be here, having endless conversations about how it's impacting upon us for days on end, weeks on end, months on end, that is going to be draining. I want you to hold in mind the idea of the 90-second rule. Essentially what this means is when we experience an emotion, i.e. anxiety, I want you to be sitting with that emotion for 90 seconds. Okay, so for example, you know, again, I sort of relate it back to earlier today. Okay, I'm anxious that this presentation isn't starting on time. Okay, let me just notice that anxiety. Let me know, I'm noticing where it sits physically in me. Okay, and what will happen? I didn't do this early because I was really keen to get on, but had I have sat with it for 90 seconds, what would have started to happen is that anxiety would have naturally started to abate. Okay, it naturally would start to come down, but it requires us to sit and tolerate that emotion. And 90 seconds is a fairly optimal time to do that. We need to hold in mind the idea of a strong back and a soft front. Okay, so I am willing to experience any emotion that comes into me now, be that anxiety, anger, frustration, whatever it is. I am willing to experience those emotions even though they're uncomfortable, because my back is strong enough to take whatever emotions come into me. Okay, if I have a strong front and a strong back, I'm not going to feel anything. Okay, I'm going to probably numb, I'm going to push things away, but I need to be willing to feel anxious in order to manage it and better able to deal with it. Okay, willingness and acceptance, really crucial. Really important for you to understand your triggers. Okay, emotional contagion theory. We have these wonderful things called mirror neurons in our brain. And mirror neurons, I don't know if anyone's ever interacted with a very small baby, this is where the baby starts to copy you, or they might smile back when you smile. And this is because we have these mirror neurons in our brain that are able to mimic the behavior of others. And we do this if you go to a dinner party, if you go to the mall, if you spend time with your family, your mirror neurons will be syncing up with other people's behavior. Now, what this does in evolutionary terms is helps us to maintain the relationship and the bond we have with our social group. Okay, so it serves a very good evolutionary function. But it also works against us sometimes. If we are spending time with people who are highly anxious, if we are spending time with people who are constantly talking about how awful the travel situation is and the pandemic and where we can and can't go and social distancing and everything else, those mirror neurons are also going to start firing. Okay, and we might find that starts to drain our energy. Okay, so you need to be setting clear boundaries. And I'm not talking about disowning people who may be experiencing anxiety. Let me be clear about that. But you might want to limit the amount of time that you spend with those people. You might want to limit the amount of time that you spend talking to them about the pandemic. Okay, so you can observe people's behavior, but you don't need to absorb it. But it will require you to be in that observer self where you are noticing that this person in front of you is getting highly anxious, and you choose, remember, going back to stimulus response and that freedom to choose, you choose that you are not going to engage with that. Okay, and yeah, just really important to remember that energy flows where attention goes. Okay, so your energy is going to be taken up in those kind of interactions if you're not setting healthy boundaries. Okay, observing and noticing your thoughts. I'm going to say something a little bit radical here. So you are not your thoughts. Okay, your thoughts are something quite different from you. Okay, so for example, if I said to you all now, I just want you to, in your minds, just imagine me sat here right now riding a pink elephant. Okay, now if you've got that image in your mind, you will notice that there is a part of your brain, a part of your mind that can notice yourself having that thought. Okay, so your thoughts are something separate from you. We all often act on autopilot on a day-to-day basis. So we believe and fall into the trap, we are our thoughts. Okay, but we want you to be creating some distance from your thoughts. Okay, so you might do this, and a habit you can get into the space of saying is, I notice I am having the thought that. I notice I'm having the thought that I'm not going to get to travel home this summer. I notice I'm having the thought that people are going to be really annoyed that I haven't started this presentation on time. And what we can do by creating distance from our thoughts, we take a step back, because these are just thoughts. They may be true, they may not be true. Okay, but we can just observe them. We don't have to be caught up in them. When we're caught up in them, we are not choosing how we're going to respond. When we take a step back, we can think, okay, how am I going to engage with this thought that I'm having about not being able to travel home this summer? All right. It's closely linked to the idea of radical acceptance, is this idea of differentiating between what you can control and what you can't control. Okay. Now, a few of these are a little outdated now, but I can't control whether others follow social distancing. All right. I can't control the actions of others or other people's motives, how long travel restrictions are going to go on for. I can't control all of those things. But the things I can control, limiting my social media use, turning off the news, my own social distancing, I can control these things. And I would invite you after today's talk, maybe draw out a couple of circles like this, things you can control in the middle, and then things that are outside of your control at the moment. And if we can let go of the things that we cannot control, we reduce our suffering. Of course, it's still going to be irritating if we see that people are not following social distancing. But then we just need to remind ourselves, I notice I'm having the thought that I'm frustrated that people are not following social distancing, but it's outside of my control. And so I'm choosing to let it go. Okay. Some ideas in terms of self-soothing. This is important if you are experiencing anxiety. You might want to be calming your mind through, just affirmations to yourself. This will pass at some point. I'm safe. I'm doing the best that I can. That sort of positive self-talk, and doing that very deliberately. If you can, just stilling yourself, taking some time to meditate, or just to sit and just to be and not to react, and taking a break from the news. I would strongly advise all of you to limit your news consumption as much as possible. We are constantly surrounded by news, and the bulk of news is not, by and large, not sort of positive, okay, and will trigger that fear response. So I'm not talking about shutting off from what's happening in terms of the pandemic, but I am talking about limiting that news consumption, maybe to half an hour, 20 minutes a day or something like that, because the news doesn't generally dramatically change day to day. And if there are briefings about, travel, you can be sure that you will hear about that if they are important, maybe from your colleagues or your family. So I think limiting news can be helpful for sure. Being kind to your body. Guys, if you're experiencing anxiety, and anybody that comes to see me who is struggling with anxiety, this is where we start, right in the middle here, okay? How much caffeine are you drinking? Okay, because caffeine will have what we call a paradoxical effect on the body. So it speeds us up. Okay, as we know, caffeine is a stimulant. People will usually drink lots of coffee to try and get through the day, but it mimics the effects of anxiety in the body. Okay, so really trying to limit caffeine intake or going caffeine free completely. Drinking some soothing teas instead, so maybe chamomile, peppermint, all of this kind of stuff. Exercising, guys. Exercising 5 times a week for 30 minutes is the equivalent to having or taking an antidepressant medication. Okay, 5 lots of 30-minute exercise per week has the same impact on your mood as an antidepressant. Okay, so trying to go out for those walks. I know it's very hot at the moment, but trying to get to the gym if you can, trying to go for a late night or early morning walk, working out at home, on the range of sort of YouTube workouts that are there, whatever it is, trying to engage in some exercise. Okay, not only does this help us sort of burn off some of the adrenaline if we're feeling anxious, but really does do wonders for our mood overall. 7 hours of sleep. If I could see you all now, I would get you to raise your hands if you'd had a minimum of 7 hours of sleep. And I guarantee a good number of people on this call probably wouldn't have, okay? 7 hours of sleep. Again, if people are struggling with anxiety, this is where we try and start. Now, of course, sometimes anxiety will impact on our ability to go to sleep. If this is the case, and you're noticing lots of anxious thoughts at night, I would recommend getting in touch with a professional just for a few sessions around, helping you to get to sleep. Loads of self-help books out there as well, but really trying to stress the importance of getting 7 hours of sleep. And of course, eating a balanced diet is going to help. Soothing your soul, meditation, prayer, spiritual practices. And please don't forget the importance of engaging in creative play and just having fun, okay? Switching off from work, switching off from the news, doing things that bring you fulfillment and joy, even though there is a global pandemic, okay? Right, we want you also to be naming your emotions, okay? I want to talk to you about something called emotional granularity, okay? So there are 4 sort of major emotions, okay? Bad, mad, sad, and glad. Okay, so anger, worry, happiness, sadness. All right, and generally, if we're in a conversation, we're asking people, how are you? Yeah, I'm good, I'm happy, or yeah, not feeling too great. Okay, so a bit sad. We want you to be naming your emotions on a much finer level, okay, and naming them with compassion and with curiosity. All right. So actually, how am I feeling about the pandemic right now? Well, I'm feeling frustrated that I can't get home, but I'm also feeling glad that I get to spend a summer in Dubai. But I'm also feeling a little bit nervous about, what's going to happen later on in the year, whatever it may be. But really trying to name those emotions on a more granular level. What we find is that people who are able to detect subtle changes in their emotional state generally experience fewer symptoms of mental health difficulties. Okay, so if I'm able at an early stage to notice, okay, I feel flustered, what can I then do about feeling flustered? So I can take some action, but I have to be aware to begin with. I'm going to really highlight this idea of compassion. So tending to your emotions with compassion. I want you to get into the headspace of no emotions are bad. All right. Some are less comfortable than others, for sure, but no emotion is bad. And usually an emotion is showing up because it needs to, because it's trying to tell us something. Okay, if I am feeling nervous because infection rates are increasing somewhere, then I need to think to myself, okay, I'm feeling nervous. What do I now do with that? It's okay for me to feel nervous about this. How am I going to soothe myself with some of those strategies that I talked about on the previous slide? But I have to be compassionate towards those emotions. I have to almost kind of welcome them in. This is the idea of willingness that we talked about earlier, willing to experience them, labeling your emotions, trying not to feed the story. Okay, so if I am feeling particularly anxious about something to do with the pandemic, the more I talk about it, the more I tell myself that story or narrative, the more intense and overwhelming that story is going to get, okay? Because I'm triggering my fear response. So trying not to feed the story. And I talked about the 90-second rule already today. You're also going to want to, if you're experiencing high levels of anxiety, just trying to ground yourself. Remember I said earlier, anxiety is generally future-based. What if? What if this happens? What if that doesn't happen? How's this going to go? Anxiety is generally future-based. Grounding is about coming back to the present moment. So absorbing yourself, grounding yourself in whatever is going on right now. So this is meditation, this is mindfulness, but it's very much coming back to the here and now. So, if you're noticing you're feeling really anxious, just going to the bathroom, just doing some mindful hand washing, really feeling the soap and water on your skin, being absorbed in that moment. When your attention is focused on this, your attention cannot be focused on what's happening next. Sure, anxiety-provoking thoughts may still come to mind, and then you just go back to centering yourself in the present moment. And really getting good at mindfulness and meditation is a great way to become great at grounding yourself. You might want to take a short walk. If you're going to do that, I would say leads on to the next point. Focus your five senses, engage your five senses. How many of us, when we go for a walk, will simply just walk, or actually more commonly, as we often see, sort of be on our phones, responding to emails or to WhatsApps? But engage your five senses. Feel the sun on your skin, feel the wind in your hair, feel your feet as they sort of go down step by step onto the ground. Become absorbed in that walk. And you'll notice things that you didn't previously notice. And again, your attention is directed on something other than those thoughts. Aromatherapy can provide some relaxation and just a general sense of orientating yourself in the here and now. Guys, this does take practice. Okay, when we are used, and as many of you will be in professional services, to thinking ahead a good deal of the time, it takes practice and skill to be able to come back and ground ourselves in the present moment. Right? If anxiety does boil over into a panic attack, it's important that you know what is going on. I would recommend that you go onto the National Health Service in the UK, the NHS website, to find out a little bit more about panic attacks, but know the signs of a panic attack. So generally somebody is going to be hyperventilating, somebody is probably going to seem quite disorientated, they may find it difficult to talk, and they may believe that they are having a heart attack. Okay, so important for you to know the signs. If you are yourself experiencing a panic attack, you want to tell yourself, I am experiencing a panic attack. I know this is not dangerous and I cannot die from it. This will pass. We have to allow panic attacks to ride their course, unless we're taking some kind of rescue medication, but we generally have to allow them to ride their course. As I say, plenty more information on the NHS website, and I would keenly direct you there. 4-7-8 breathing. This can help, usually not in the very middle of a panic attack, but sort of either side, and a practice for you to get into. A wonderful app called Breathwork. If you go to your app stores, and this is a guided deep breathing app. Not the same as meditation, but we are purely trying to focus on our breathing rhythm to try and turn off that adrenaline and cortisol supply. So the 4-7-8 rhythm is breathing in for 4, holding our breath for a count of 7, and then exhaling for 8. Doing that about, sort of for 3-4 minutes will start reducing your blood adrenaline and cortisol levels. Okay, so really important practice to get into. How are we doing for time? I am making time up, which is good. When all else fails, guys, distract. We don't generally think that distraction is a good strategy for managing anxiety, because usually when we just distract, things just keep coming back. Okay, it may provide some kind of temporary relief, but it isn't a strategy to be used over a prolonged period of time. But if you are feeling really anxious and meditation isn't working for you, you've done your exercise for today, you've ground yourself back in the present moment, you might just need to direct your attention elsewhere, playing a game on your phone, changing your physical environment and getting out, or shifting activity completely. Okay, but I do want you to remember, distracting is generally the easiest thing for us to do, but it's not helpful in the long term on the whole. Okay, and those other strategies that I talked about slightly earlier are much more beneficial. Okay, guys, I have made up the time. I appreciate I've whistled through that at quite some pace, but I do hope that was helpful. I'm very happy for sort of 5 minutes or so to take any questions that you might have. I have got a couple of questions that I can see here. Yes, so I've got a question here. Can I explain a little bit more about the 90-second rule? Yes, of course. And I did skim over that a little bit, didn't I? So the 90-second rule. So essentially, if there is a stressful trigger in the environment in front of me, my body's natural responses will create an emotion. Okay, so imagine there is a dog over there and I'm scared of dogs. I will see the dog, my body's fear response will kick in. So the 90-second rule is about me saying, for the next 90 seconds, I am just going to experience this anxiety. I'm going to sit with it. I'm going to tolerate it. So, okay, I'm noticing that I feel really anxious, and I notice I'm having the thought I'm anxious about that dog. Let me just sit with this for 90 seconds. Oh, it feels uncomfortable. I can feel it in my stomach. I can feel it in my chest. I can feel my shoulders tensing. I don't like this feeling of anxiety, but I'm willing to make room for it. I'm willing to experience it. And generally what will happen after about 90 seconds is that emotion will start to become less intense. It'll start to drop off. Now, of course, if the dog is getting closer and closer and closer and sort of nibbling at my heels, then obviously my anxiety is still going to remain quite high. But, say in relation to the pandemic, this may be about you reading a news article about travel restrictions and thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to travel. Oh, this is awful. Put down the phone, sit back. Okay, I'm noticing I'm having the thought I'm not going to be able to get back for the summer. This isn't nice. I don't like this, but I'm willing to tolerate and experience it. Doing that for 90 seconds and you will should start to notice that emotion becomes less intense. So I hope that adds a little bit more context. Let me go to a couple of other questions here. Is anxiety and a panic attack the same thing? Yeah, so panic attacks are the body's physiological reaction to high levels of cortisol and adrenaline. Okay, so where the body becomes so overwhelmed with the fear response, the adrenaline and cortisol really flushing through the system at that point. And so a panic attack is the body's response to that. What will then happen often is our minds will then kick in and go, oh my gosh, I'm having a panic attack, or even worse, you know, a heart attack, and that further sort of increases the symptoms of the panic attack. It makes us more anxious. So the short answer to your question is yes, panic and anxiety panic attacks are driven by anxiety, and if one has a diagnosis of panic disorder, that is categorized as an anxiety disorder. So I hope that's helpful. Are there any practical tips about maintaining work-life balance, especially with work invading our home space these days? So we actually run a separate webinar specifically looking at managing work-life balance, and you can see our schedule for our talks and webinars coming up for this month and next month. But yeah, we give an hour's talk on that. So yeah, I welcome you to attend that. Somebody here just asking, can you elaborate on the 4-7-8 rule? Yeah, so that's the 4-7-8 breathing rhythm. Okay, so if I'm noticing that I'm feeling anxious and overwhelmed, I'm breathing in for 4 seconds, I'm holding my breath for 7, and I'm exhaling for 8. Okay, in for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. And if I do that for maybe 3 minutes, my blood cortisol and adrenaline will start to reduce. Okay, I would be saying to you, you know, try and build in that breathing rhythm, you know, maybe 8, 9, 10 times a day, you know, maybe before every client call, or maybe before every presentation, or when you wake up in the morning, getting into the habit of regulating our breathing rhythms. It's amazing how many of us can breathe in quite a shallow way day to day, and most of us aren't conscious of our breathing rhythms. But by engaging in these deeper forms of breathing, this can be really beneficial in terms of managing anxiety. Okay. Somebody's asked here, how do I ignore the fact, how do I ignore things that we can't control? So how do I let go of them? That's a really, really good question. And what I would say is, I think mindfulness is a really good place to start with this. So mindfulness is the sort of modern day practice, although based on sort of Buddhist philosophies, but it's the idea of coming into contact with the present moment. So if I am noticing that I am having thoughts about the things I can't control, mindfulness and coming back to the present moment is about saying, okay, I notice I'm having this thought, I don't like it, I don't want it here, but I can only control what I can control. So I'm going to come back to the present moment. I might need to tell myself some sort of positive affirmations, you know, I know this is really difficult for me, but I have to let go of this. I know I'm willing to let go of this. It is a practice and it's a skill. So I hope that's helpful. Some people will sometimes try and distract, but we feel that going with that more sort of mindfulness principle is beneficial. Okay. So one more question. Are there any good resources for finding out a little more about anxiety? Yeah, so I would advise come to our social media accounts. We have a lot of information, free content on anxiety, lots of information on there. There are some really good self-help books out there. I would say I would recommend a good self-help book called The Happiness Trap. That's by a guy called Dr. Russ Harris, who takes quite a radical look at how to manage anxiety. And a lot of what I've talked about today is sort of featured in the book, but that's a really good self-help book, and that's called The Happiness Trap by Dr. Russ Harris. So guys, just looking at the time then, and we usually finish at 5:02, so we're running slightly over. So we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you for all of your questions. And again, for all of you that were on time, or those of you that may have come late, I am sincerely sorry for starting 15 minutes late. We had the Wi-Fi here went down. It never goes down, but of course it was going to when I did a corporate webinar. So, but I hope today's been helpful for you. As I say, we run many of these free webinars across the course of the month. You can find out more about us on our website there, the Lighthouse Arabia, and also on our Instagram accounts, Lighthouse Arabia and at Dr. Saliha Afridi. Okay. So guys, it's been an absolute pleasure being here today. Thank you so much for joining me and wishing you a good day ahead. All right, take care.